In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. Chosen one, you didn't stumble upon this message, you were guided here. Heaven arranged this moment long before you knew you needed it. And the truth is, your soul has been silently crying out for confirmation, for a sign that the pain wasn't pointless, that the seeds you planted in the dark didn't disappear into nothing. This is that sign. You've carried so much without recognition. You've stayed when it would have been easier to run. You've given when you've had almost nothing left to give. And still you poured out love. You chose forgiveness. You kept your heart clean when it would have been easier to retaliate. Do you even realize how rare that kind of obedience is? God saw it all. He heard the prayers you whispered when no one was around. He noticed the nights you stayed awake, battling thoughts no one knew you struggled with. Heaven recorded every moment you turned the other cheek, every time you gave without being thanked, every time you chose peace over pride. What if the very moments you felt most invisible were the ones God treasured the most? Now the time has come. What was once hidden is about to be revealed. What was once done in secret is about to be honored in the open. This isn't just encouragement, it's a divine announcement. God is not only proud of you, He's about to reward you in ways that will silence every doubt you ever carried. But before we go any deeper, pause with me. If your spirit already recognizes this word is for you, type 777 in the comments right now. That number isn't random, it's sacred. It's a prophetic confirmation that your life is aligned with something much bigger than you can see. And to every soul who has supported this ministry through Super Thanks, thank you. Truly, you didn't just give to a channel, you responded to a frequency from heaven. Whether you supported financially, prayed in secret, or simply showed up week after week, God saw it all. May your generosity be returned to you, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. Now lean in, because what comes next is not ordinary. It's holy, it's weighty, and it's for you. God is about to reveal the reasons behind the quiet seasons, the hidden victories, and the invisible strength you didn't even know you carried. Let's go deeper. God's chosen ones. Heaven saw what you did, and God is proud of you. Chapter 1. God saw you stand when you couldn't record it. You never made an announcement about it, but heaven recorded it anyway. In moments where silence would have been safer, when nodding along could have opened more doors, you stood not because you were trying to be noble, but because something holy inside you refused to bow. That was the Holy Spirit, not ego, not fear. Spirit-led strength clothed in obedience. What made you walk away from things that promised influence but would have fractured your soul? What held you steady when compromise could have eased the pressure? You didn't choose the easy applause, you chose the slow obedience. That's not failure, that's formation. Have you ever found yourself wondering why your no cost more than other people's yes? Some around you played the game and gained position. They learned how to water down conviction to become more acceptable. But you, God's chosen, were built for something deeper than applause. You were built for legacy. Daniel was too. In Babylon, he declined the king's food and drink, not to be difficult, but to remain consecrated. Daniel 18. No one forced him to resist. No law would have condemned him if he'd given in, but he chose private purity over public reward. Like you, he wasn't after favor with man. He was aligned with heaven, and heaven promoted him on heaven's terms. Could it be that your silence is doing more in the spirit realm than noise ever could in the physical? That's not just a test of patience. It's a validation of your identity. It means you've been trusted with hidden assignments. Jesus understood that too. After being baptized, he was immediately led into the wilderness. No platform, no spotlight, just solitude, hunger, and spiritual warfare. Matthew 4:1-11. 3 times Satan offered him power without the pain, glory without the cross, but he refused. And when he walked out of the desert, he walked out in power. Matthew 4:11. Have you realized that you're not being punished? You're being purified. Others made shortcuts look like strategy. You chose sanctification instead. They got recognition. You got refined. But don't confuse heaven's pace with heaven's absence. When no one else clapped, angels did. What if the delay has been God's defense over you, keeping you from becoming someone your soul could never carry? Elijah once curled under a tree and begged to die, 1 Kings 19:4. The weight of his calling overwhelmed him. But even in that collapse, God didn't disqualify him. He fed him, strengthened him, whispered direction instead of shouting rebuke. And that's what he did with you too. Not every moment of weakness is failure. Some are just thresholds where heaven steps in and says, rest, you're still mine. Have you noticed how your obedience keeps costing you visibility, but increasing your discernment? That's because you're being trained for something weightier. Popularity fades, but purity governs realms no spotlight can reach. In 1981, Pope John Paul II, revered across nations, was shot at close range in an assassination attempt. He didn't retaliate. He forgave the shooter. Quietly, he visited him in prison. It was not for media coverage. It was for heaven's witness. He once said, the future starts today, not tomorrow. What if your unseen acts today are shaping a future your enemies will never be able to touch? There was a woman named Karima, a school janitor in Boston, who was asked to sign off on a new policy that would remove prayer rooms from the school. It wasn't required, it was just encouraged. Signing would have guaranteed her a promotion. She declined. Years later, one of the girls who prayed in that room became a city councilwoman and created programs for underserved youth. No one knew about Karima's decision, but heaven did. Even in nature, this principle holds true. The alpine larch, a rare conifer, doesn't flourish in lush soil. It thrives in frozen, jagged terrain. While others bloom in spring, the larch waits until autumn to reveal its golden brilliance. It grows slowly, deeply, enduring winds that strip lesser trees bare. Could it be that you were made for a season that requires more silence before the shining? You didn't miss your moment, you honored it. You didn't bend to fear, you bowed only to God. And heaven saw it all. Angels didn't just applaud your victories, they watched your restraint. They saw you bite your tongue when you could have snapped back. They marked the moment your flesh screamed yes, but your spirit whispered no. That kind of strength doesn't shout, it endures. And in a world that praises performance, that kind of obedience disrupts entire systems in the spirit. What does it cost to walk away from something beautiful that isn't blessed? You know you've done it, and heaven witnessed it all. God marked the moments you turned your back on appealing shortcuts. You weren't trying to be righteous, you were trying to be real. The temptation to compromise didn't pass you by. It stood in your face. It made promises. but your yes belonged to God. And that's what made your no so powerful. You weren't resisting because you didn't desire it. You resisted because you desired God more. Joseph in Genesis knew that feeling after being sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. He could have compromised his integrity to escape pain or gain favor. But even in prison, he served faithfully, and eventually Pharaoh elevated him to second in command. Genesis 41:41. What if your restraint is the very reason heaven is releasing authority into your life now? Have you asked yourself why the opposition increased right when you finally felt settled? It's not because you're failing. It's because your no has triggered spiritual warfare. But more than that, it's invited angelic attention. Heaven doesn't ignore courage. It surrounds it. You chose character when comfort would have been quicker. You chose obedience when applause was right there for the taking. You chose purpose when popularity would have opened more doors. These weren't dramatic decisions with cheering crowds. These were private altars. Decisions made in the hallway between rejection and reward. Could it be that heaven was always less concerned with how fast you arrived and more impressed with how purely you walked? In a world obsessed with acceleration, your pace felt foolish, but it was faith. What looked like delay was actually divine distinction. Isaiah 64:4 declares, since ancient times no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you, who acts on behalf of those who wait for him. This isn't just about waiting in silence. It's about waiting with integrity. And now something is shifting. You can feel it, can't you? That internal stillness, that spiritual clarity. It's not random, it's response. God is not just preparing blessings, he's preparing you for them. The reward isn't just about compensation, it's confirmation. Confirmation that your discernment wasn't delusion, that your refusal wasn't rebellion, that your isolation was actually an invitation. Harriet Tubman, known as the Moses of her people, was once told she was crazy for believing she could free slaves through the Underground Railroad. But her refusal to obey unjust systems and her unwavering courage to return again and again into danger became one of the most powerful testimonies of moral bravery in history. She once said, I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. Your fight for righteousness wasn't just for you. It's creating pathways for others. And in unexpected corners of the world, quiet stories like yours are still unfolding. A man named Olivier, an investment analyst in Geneva, turned down a lucrative job that involved overseeing assets connected to unethical labor practices. No press release, no documentary, just a private conviction he couldn't silence. 5 years later, he now manages a portfolio dedicated to ethical startups across Africa. What looked like a loss became a legacy. Could it be that your no created space for a version of your future you never even knew to pray for? Because that's what heaven does. It doesn't just restore, it reveals. Even creation groans with this rhythm. The moonflower, a rare night-blooming plant, opens only under darkness. Its fragrance isn't released in daylight, only when the sun disappears. And yet those who wait to see it bloom say it's unforgettable. That's you, fragrant in the unseen, opening in sacred timing, revealing beauty born of obedience. So here's what's coming next. Not randomness, not leftover blessings, but reward. And not just for what you did, but for what you refused to do. You didn't sell out, you didn't bow down, you didn't fold under pressure, and now the favor that's been forming in secret is about to be poured out in the open. Have you ever considered that the reason it's taken so long is because God was unfolding something weighty enough to match your obedience? Get ready. You're about to see why it had to be this way. Chapter 2. God saw the tears. No one else did. You didn't weep in public, but heaven still heard every sound your soul made. If you wish to express your support further, you have the option to give super thanks with contributions of up to $120, 0 cents. I pay men to get blessing, 100 million. There were nights your body rested, but your spirit didn't. You laid in bed staring at the ceiling, whispering, God, please don't let me break. And even when no one answered your messages, even when your strength was mistaken for having no needs, you carried the weight in silence, in prayer, in faith. Have you ever wondered how many moments you survived that no one will ever know about? The grief that didn't get posted, the heartache that didn't get comforted, the smile you wore that didn't match the storm behind your ribs. You were bleeding but still blessing, fading but still faithful, alone but still available. Jesus saw you then, just as he saw Mary Magdalene at the tomb, weeping in confusion, overwhelmed by grief and loss. John 20:11-16. Everyone else thought it was over, but Jesus showed up. Not in glory, not in fire, but in the gentleness of calling her name. Mary, that's how God has met you too. Not always with a miracle, but with a whisper. And sometimes that whisper is what kept you alive. You gave love freely to people who didn't know how to return it. You prayed for healing while battling your own brokenness. You poured encouragement into others when your own cup was nearly dry. Have you noticed how God often strengthens you for others in the very place where you yourself are still bleeding? That's not dysfunction, that's divine strength. David knew that kind of contradiction. Anointed as king, but hiding in caves, singing songs to God while fleeing for his life. Psalm 56:8 says, you keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book. Your pain didn't fall into the void. It fell into divine record. Could it be that your most sacred growth came from your most silent battles? You didn't become who you are in the spotlight. You became that person in the shadows when no one affirmed you. When no one checked in, when God was your only witness. The prophet Jeremiah was called the weeping prophet. Not because he was the weeping prophet, 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 not because he was the whipping 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 prophet, not because he was weak, but because he felt deeply. He cried over the people's rebellion, pleaded with them, carried the burden of intercession, and yet through every tear God didn't abandon him. He strengthened his voice. That's what he's done with you too. Your tears weren't weakness, they were consecration. Have you ever asked why your greatest spiritual clarity often came after your deepest emotional collapse? It's not coincidence. God speaks from the rubble, from the wreckage, from the place where you have no more image to uphold and only truth remains. Mother Teresa, known for her compassion, once wrote in her private journals that she went years without feeling God's presence, and still she served, still she smiled, still she gave. Her endurance didn't come from feelings, it came from faith. I have found the paradox, she wrote, that if you love until it hurts, there can be no more hurt, only more love. You've lived that paradox, and heaven has taken note. There was a woman named Sarah, a youth counselor in Johannesburg, who showed up every day for troubled teens while silently grieving the loss of her own child. No one knew, not even her students. Her comfort came from whispered prayers during her lunch breaks. Years later, one of those teens became a counselor herself, inspired by the warmth Saraya gave without asking for anything in return. The light you gave away in your darkest hour was not wasted. Have you ever paused to consider how many lives are standing today because you didn't fall when you could have? You became someone's anchor while drifting in your own storm. That's not just resilience, that's spiritual inheritance. Even creation speaks this language. The blue morpho butterfly, one of the most radiant creatures in the rainforest, spends most of its life camouflaged in dull browns and grays. It only reveals its shimmering blue wings when it flies, and even then, only when caught in motion under sunlight. That's you. Heaven's hid in brilliance, only fully visible when moved by divine light through pain. God didn't waste your wounds. He turned them into windows. Windows through which others could see grace, strength, hope. Windows through which heaven could shine. You need to understand this deeply. Tears don't disappear. They plant in the unseen soil of sorrow. Every drop that slipped from your eyes became a sacred seed, and those seeds, they've been germinating in God's presence, waiting for divine rain, and now the clouds are opening. Have you ever sensed that your deepest grief was somehow preparing the way for a joy no one could steal? You didn't just cry, you sowed. You didn't just break, you built altars. And now the time has come. God is turning those invisible sacrifices into undeniable blessings. Psalm 126:5 declares, "Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy." That isn't poetic comfort, it's prophetic promise. The sorrow wasn't pointless, it was prophetic promise. The sorrow wasn't pointless, it was prophetic. What if your pain wasn't just endured, but invested? God is releasing restoration not only to your emotions, but to the core of your being. The spiritual toll, the mental weariness, the financial strain, none of it escaped heaven's eyes. What you carried in silence is now becoming heaven's priority. Job understood the weight of that promise. He lost everything: family, wealth, health. His friends misunderstood him. His wife urged him to curse God, and yet Job held on. He wept, he questioned, he pleaded, but he didn't walk away. And when God restored him, it wasn't partial. Scripture says the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Job 42:10. That's not just recovery, that's redemption. Have you ever wondered why God let you survive what others didn't come back from? There's a reason. You didn't just make it through, you came out with something sacred: compassion, depth, discernment. And those qualities are the currency of spiritual legacy. There is honor coming to your name, not the kind the world fabricates, the kind heaven bestows. Quiet strength will now speak louder than noise. Invisible battles will now birth visible victories. The peace you thought was lost forever, it's returning. The joy that slipped through your hands, it's being restored. Could it be that your reward is not compensation, but confirmation? That you weren't walking blindly, you were walking bravely. Desmond Tutu, South African Archbishop and moral voice during apartheid, once said, "Hope is being able to see that there is light despite all of the darkness." He didn't just speak it, he lived it. Leading through national trauma, forgiving enemies, and building reconciliation where revenge seemed inevitable. You've walked that kind of hope too. Quiet, greedy, and radiant in the shadows. And stories like yours echo across the earth. There's Jalen, a young nurse in Detroit who continued serving in ICU through waves of exhaustion and personal loss. He'd lost his sister during the pandemic, but chose to stay on call for others. He prayed over unconscious patients, sang softly through his mask. He never made the news, but he changed atmospheres. Like you, he kept giving even while grieving. Have you ever noticed how often heaven moves just after your breaking point, not before? That's not coincidence. That's divine rhythm. Your breaking didn't disqualify you. It qualified you for blessings not built by effort, but by endurance. Even creation confirms this mystery. The desert rainly, hidden deep beneath cracked ground, lies dormant for years and then suddenly bursts into bloom after the first heavy rain. It doesn't need perfect conditions, it just needs pressure to lift. That's you bursting forth from barren seasons, stunning even yourself with what's been forming all along. God is not just restoring what was lost, He's rebuilding what was never fully seen. The beauty of your heart, the gold forged in your fire, the weight of your worship when no one was watching. You cried, but you never stopped. You wept, but you still worshipped. You broke, but you broke in God's hands. Have you realized that what you held on to in private is what God is now about to display in public? The same hands that held you in the valley are now lifting you to a mountaintop. This isn't just breakthrough, this is birth. You were not forgotten. You were being formed, not neglected, but anointed in hiding. And now the fullness of heaven is responding not just to your prayer, but to your perseverance. Chapter 3. God saw your silence when you could have fought back. You knew the truth, but you chose stillness. There were conversations where your name was dragged through the mud, rooms you never walked into, but your character was already tried and sentenced. People twisted your silence, mocked your integrity, and treated your restraint like weakness. They distorted your motives, crafted narratives without your voice, and weaponized your compassion like it was a flaw, and still you said nothing. Have you ever questioned whether your silence made you look guilty, whether holding your peace cost you your credibility? But heaven saw differently. Heaven saw your discipline as divine. You didn't remain quiet because you were powerless. You were powerful enough to let God defend you. There's a reason you didn't react. You had every right to. You had the truth, you had the proof, you had the full story. But you chose not to enter their battlefield because your war was spiritual, not social. Jesus did the same before Pilate, accused by religious leaders, lied about by his own people. He stood in silence as the crowd shouted for his crucifixion. But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Matthew 27:14. His silence wasn't defeat, it was authority. He didn't need to justify himself because he trusted the Father's plan. Could it be that your silence wasn't surrender but strategy? That the reason you walked away wasn't fear, it was faith? God saw every moment you swallowed your pain so you wouldn't wound someone else. He saw every tear that fell while others laughed at what they thought was your weakness. He saw you on your knees praying, not just for vindication, but for protection from bitterness. That kind of surrender isn't passive, it's prophetic. Moses experienced that too when Korah and his followers rose up to challenge him, accusing him of arrogance and false leadership. Numbers 16. Moses didn't fight back. He fell face down before God. And God himself made the truth known, not through argument, but through divine action. What if the courtroom you're waiting for isn't earthly at all, but eternal? Have you noticed that the attacks on your character intensified just as you started stepping into your calling? That's not coincidence. That's sabotage in disguise. The enemy wanted to bait you into reaction so you'd forfeit your authority. But you didn't bite. You didn't defend with rage. You defended with restraint, and heaven moved. Isaiah 30:15 reminds us, in quietness and trust is your strength. Not in noise, not in retaliation, but in holy restraint. It takes courage to stay silent when you know you could destroy someone with the truth. It takes power to stay clean when the mud is within arm's reach. Martin Luther King Jr., a pastor, prophet, and reformer, was slandered by media, spied on by government agencies, and betrayed by allies. And yet, he never let rage hijack his assignment. He said, I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. He marched not with vengeance, but with vision. You've done the same. When it would have been easier to react, you chose to rise. Ezra, a high school teacher in Sydney who was falsely accused by a parent of discrimination. He had emails that could have cleared him instantly, but he waited. He chose peace over public humiliation. Weeks later, the parent privately apologized, and the school promoted him for handling the situation with wisdom. He didn't defend himself online. He let time and character speak. Have you ever felt the ache of being misunderstood while carrying a heart full of clarity? You didn't shut down. You didn't strike back. You prayed. You served. You kept building, even while being broken. Even creation reflects this mysterious power. The snow leopard, one of the world's most elusive predators, navigates the harshest mountain terrains in silence. It doesn't roar like lions or howl like wolves. Its strength is in stillness. Its survival is in restraint. And though rarely seen, its presence changes the entire ecosystem. You're like that. Rare, still, powerful, and sacredly strategic. You didn't post about it. You didn't retaliate. You didn't manipulate the narrative. You gave God the courtroom. And now He's issuing the verdict, not just of your innocence, but of your anointing. They thought you were shrinking, but God was shielding. They mistook your silence for surrender when in fact it was sanctification. You weren't backing away, you were being repositioned. In a world that teaches retaliate, your restraint was revolutionary. You didn't scream, you didn't chase clarity from the crowd. You let your heart break in private, and heaven called it holy. Have you noticed how often your quietest seasons are followed by your biggest shifts? That's not coincidence. That's spiritual law. When you protected your peace instead of proving your point, you positioned yourself for promotion. God has not overlooked how you handled injustice. When the world expected retaliation, you chose reverence. You went higher when the enemy pulled low. You sang when you could have shouted. You chose worship over warfare. And God wrote it down. Luke 6:28 commands, bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. You didn't just read that. You lived it. And now the reward being released is not just a gift, it's justice. Quiet, pure, heaven-sent justice. What if your greatest victories are being written in heaven's courtroom, not social media's timeline? What's coming to you isn't driven by pity, it's driven by precision. God has measured your tears, tracked your restraint, and honored your obedience, and now He's responding. Esther knew that process. She could have exposed Haman's plot early, but she waited, she listened, she moved in divine timing, not emotional urgency. And when the time was right, her words dismantled deception, and the very gallows built for her people were reversed on their enemy. You too have been walking in the kind of patience that heaven partners with. Have you ever felt like holding your peace was costing you visibility? Like staying still made others believe the lies? It didn't. It made room for heaven to speak on your behalf. Romans 12:19 declares, do not take revenge, but leave room for God's wrath. And that's exactly what you did. You left room. You let God have space to be your defender. And now He's about to speak so loudly that no one will remember the lies, only the legacy. Dr. Bernice King, daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., carries her father's legacy, not with bitterness but boldness. In the face of misunderstanding, political pressure, and public scrutiny, she chooses spiritual clarity over noise. She once said, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. That's what's coming for you. Not just relief, but real, undeniable restoration. Marisol, a non-profit coordinator in Mexico City, was falsely accused of mishandling funds. She could have fired back with documents and emails, but instead she waited quietly with dignity. Months later, the truth emerged. Not only was her name cleared, but the organization elevated her to national leadership. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy wrapped in worship. Could it be that your restraint is becoming heaven's resonance? That your silence is echoing louder in the spirit realm than words ever could on earth? Even creation reveals this principle. The ocean doesn't argue with the rocks. It pulls back in silence and returns with a force that reshapes the entire coastline. That's what's happening to you. The stillness you held is becoming the momentum God uses to carve new territory. Now comes the response. Not from you, but from God. You stayed quiet when your flesh wanted to explain. You stayed clean when your anger wanted to swing. You stayed under when ego wanted to rise. Have you considered that your greatest vindication will be the fruit of what you didn't say? Because heaven remembers not just what you endured, but how you endured it. The same mouths that doubted you will witness a flood of favor they can't explain. Not to shame them, but to remind them that God doesn't bless noise, He blesses obedience. You stayed low. Now God is lifting you. You stayed hidden. Now God is highlighting you. You stayed pure. And now heaven is about to thunder on your behalf. Chosen one, your silence was not absence. It was an act of worship, and heaven saw it all. Chapter 4, God saw how you loved even when you weren't loved back. Some people saw your love as naive, but heaven saw it as noble. You gave more than was comfortable. You loved beyond reason. You kept showing up, not because it was deserved, but because the Spirit inside you would let you abandon those God had placed in your path. That kind of love doesn't come from logic, it comes from the Lamb. Have you ever asked why your heart keeps expanding, even when it's been wounded? Why you keep giving when the returns are few, the gratitude scarce, and the connection one-sided. It's not emotional imbalance, it's mansis. It's its divine reflection. There's a kind of love that cannot be replicated by willpower alone. It's the love that doesn't recoil when rejected. The kind that chooses faithfulness even in the face of distance. You gave that kind not because they earned it, but because heaven entrusted it to you. You extended grace in drought. You gave warmth to emotional coldness. You remembered birthdays for people who forgot your existence. And when others questioned why keep pouring into those who can't reciprocate, you asked yourself the same thing. David knew that tension. He showed unwavering loyalty to King Saul, a man who tried to kill him, hunted him like an enemy, and viewed his love as a threat. And yet, David refused to retaliate. In fact, when Saul died, David mourned him with honor. To Samuel 11:17-27. That's not foolishness, that's faithfulness forged in fire. Have you ever noticed how love tests your strength more than hate ever could? Hate gives you an excuse. Love demands a cross. And you carried yours quietly. You bore it in silence, not seeking recognition, not manipulating outcomes, not demanding closure. That's where God saved your son. You just kept loving. God saw every unreturned message, every unreciprocated gesture, every silent prayer whispered for someone who never once prayed for you. He saw the way you held space for their healing while hiding your own hurt. That wasn't self-abandonment, that was sacred surrender. Romans 5:8 says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You were never meant to die for anyone, but you did mirror the nature of the one who did by loving first, even when love didn't return. Have you ever felt like your love was wasted, like it fell into a black hole of apathy? It didn't. It fell into heaven's account, and not one drop went unrecorded. The prophet Hosea was commended by God to marry Gomer, a woman who would continually leave him, betray him, and abandon covenant. And still Hosea pursued. Still he redeemed her. Not for romance, for revelation. To demonstrate what God's love looks like. Scandalous, sacrificial, persistent. Hosea 3, that's the love you've walked in, misunderstood on earth, celebrated in heaven. Have you ever wondered if your endurance in love is birthing something far deeper than healing? Maybe even legacy? Because that's how generational cycles are broken. Not through revenge, but through redemptive love. Fred Rogers, better known as Mr. Rogers, was not just a children's TV host. He was a trained minister who saw television as a pulpit to speak kindness into chaos. When critics mocked his tone, dismissed his message as soft, or misunderstood his compassion as performative, he kept loving, quietly, faithfully, unshaken. He once said, love isn't a state of perfect caring. It is an active noun like struggle. You've lived that struggle with strength, with reverence. Lena, a seamstress in Nairobi who supported her sister for over a decade, covering school fees, rent, and medical bills. When Lena fell ill, the sister disappeared. No calls, no visits. But Lena never spoke a word of resentment. She simply kept praying. Months later, her sister returned, repentant and broken, and Lena embraced her like no offense ever occurred. That kind of forgiveness can be faked. It's forged in worship. Have you paused to realize that your capacity to love like this is not human but holy? It is evidence that heaven is alive in you. Even nature honors this pattern. The African acacia tree under intense drought still provides nutrients to nearby plants through its root system. Unseen, unnoticed, and often unrewarded, it survives in scarcity while sustaining others in secret. That's you, rooted in love, even when no one acknowledges the cost. God saw how you stayed tender in a hardened world, how you kept showing up in silence, how you gave without expecting, and how you bled without demanding compensation. Chosen one, you weren't being foolish, you were being formed. Chosen one, love like yours never vanishes. It leaves an imprint. Heaven saw what others overlooked. God recorded every quiet sacrifice, the gentle texts no one replied to, the rides you gave without asking for gas money, the birthdays you remembered when yours passed unnoticed. Each moment was written in the archives of glory, not because of scale, but because of sincerity. Have you ever felt invisible in the very places you chose to show up most fully? Love, when unreturned, can feel like a wound, but in the kingdom, it becomes a witness. Every act you sweat in faith has not faded. It has formed a harvest. You kept loving while bleeding. You stayed kind while tired. You extended grace in seasons when you needed it most. And even when love wasn't reciprocated, you didn't let it alter the purity of your giving. That's not softness, that's sacred strength. Jesus spoke of this kind of love in Luke 6:35. Love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great. You live this verse not for show, but because the Spirit wouldn't let your heart close itself in self-protection, and now that reward is taking shape. Have you paused to consider that the love you poured out is returning? Not from recycled sources, but through divinely assigned vessels. God never recycles pain, He redeems it. Not all rewards arrive with the same faces. Some come in the form of peace that feels like home. Some arrive as friends who show up without being asked. Others manifest as laughter that doesn't come with tension or rest, that isn't earned, just given. That's what's coming next. Not performance-based affection, but covenant-based connection. Ruth experienced this redemption. After losing her husband and following Naomi into unfamiliar territory, Ruth could have grown bitter. Instead, she remained faithful. Her loyalty became her pathway to destiny. God orchestrated a love story with Boaz, not as a replacement for what she lost, but as a restoration beyond what she imagined. Ruth 4:13-15, you've shown that kind of loyalty, and the same divine orchestration has already begun in your favor. Have you noticed the emotional doors closing around you lately? That's not punishment, that's pruning. Heaven is making room for the relationships that won't require you to shrink, chase, or explain yourself just to be safe. Maya Angelou, poet and prophet of dignity, once said, never make someone a priority when all you are to them is an option. She didn't say that out of bitterness, but out of wisdom born in the fire. You've learned that too. Not by becoming cold, but by becoming clear. A man named Terence, a trauma counselor in Atlanta, spent years walking with clients through their darkest hours. He gave patience, presence, and care. But when his own crisis hit, few reached out. For months he grieved in silence until a former client, now a therapist herself, returned with the same depth of love he once gave. The circle of compassion returned, not symmetrically but supernaturally. Have you realized that heaven never allows genuine love to end in loss? Every act becomes an echo. Every seed turns into sustenance, even if the soil seems unresponsive for a time. Even the wild understands this cycle. The baobab tree in Africa stores water in its massive trunk during drought. It appears swollen and strange, but inside it carries life for others, often sheltering birds, animals, and humans alike. When the rain finally comes, the tree doesn't just bloom, it bursts. You are that kind of vessel, misunderstood in waiting, miraculous in reward. The time of overflow is near, not as a repayment from people who ignored your heart, but as a restoration from a God who never did. You loved without applause. You forgave without closure. You showed up without invitation. And now heaven is opening doors without explanation. Have you ever considered that the love heaven returns is often more beautiful than the love you gave? Not because it's grander, but because it's purer. God doesn't just match what you gave, He multiplies it. The world didn't give you the love your heart deserved, but God is sending it now in waves, in warmth, in people who carry honor in their presence. This time you won't have to wonder if you're too much. You realize you are always just right for the ones who were divinely sent to receive you. Chapter 5. God saw you so when you had almost nothing. Chosen one, what you gave didn't come from surplus, it came from sacrifice. Let's speak plainly. You weren't giving because life was easy. You were giving because obedience gripped your spirit harder than fear ever could. You showed up when you should have shut down. You poured into others while praying anyone would pour back into you. And when no one did, you still kept going, not because you had enough, but because you were enough. Have you ever looked around and wondered why your own harvest seemed delayed, even though your hands were the ones sowing so much? The world saw your generosity as naivety, but heaven recognized it as maturity. That wasn't weakness, that was war. You didn't tithe because your wallet was full. You tithed because your soul was faithful. You didn't serve because you had the time. You made the time even while your own needs begged for attention. That wasn't performance, that was covenant. The Bible speaks of such sacrifice in Corinthians 9:6-8. Whoever swears sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever swears generously will also reap generously. And God is able to bless you abundantly. You believe that even when it looked irrational. You sweat into the unseen. Have you ever wondered how many miracles you helped unlock for others while you were still praying for your own? That's spiritual maturity, the kind that isn't loud but legendary. Elijah once met a widow in Zarephath, 1 Kings 178-16, who had nothing left but a handful of flour and a little oil. She was preparing a final meal for herself and her son before expecting to die, yet she gave what little she had to the prophet. And what happened next shifted her destiny. Her jar never ran dry. Her seed was survival disguised as surrender. You too have given in that kind of faith, and your jar too is about to defy logic. Have you felt lately like your giving has gone unnoticed? Like your obedience is echoing into empty space? God heard it all. Every whispered prayer, every yes when your body wanted to say, not today. Every sacrifice made in silence has been stored in sacred places. Oprah Winfrey, now a household name, often shares how she gave to others in her early career when her own resources were scarce. Not because it made financial sense, but because she knew it was a test of trust. Today her story reflects not just wealth, but impact, birth through faithful sowing. Isaiah, a young father in North Dakota, working 2 jobs while mentoring teams on weekends. He gave time, food, and attention to youth others overlooked, even when his own pantry was nearly empty. 10 years later, those same youths became leaders, and one of them returned to build Isaiah a house. Faith doesn't forget, and obedience always echoes forward. The land you sowed into may have looked barren, but in the spirit it was bursting. The African marula tree bears fruit only once a year, but when it does, its harvest is so bountiful that entire ecosystems feast. You chosen one, carry that kind of cycle. Long silence, then sudden abundance. Have you realized that sowing is never just about you? It's generational, it's spiritual, it's prophetic. Every act of faith becomes a blueprint for breakthrough. When you gave your last, you didn't know angels were being dispatched. When you encouraged others, you didn't know you were speaking into the timeline of their miracle. When you fasted quietly, you didn't see the roots you are planting under your children's future. Psalm 126:5 reminds us, those who sow in tears shall reap with songs of joy. Your tears didn't just water the ground, they baptized it. You weren't sowing into popularity, you were sowing into purpose. You didn't wait for overflow to begin pouring. You didn't wait to feel strong before strengthening others. You didn't wait for applause before sowing in obedience. And that is exactly why the floodgates are opening now. Not as a reward for perfection, but as heaven's response to endurance. How many times did you pour out your last ounce of kindness when your heart was breaking? How often did you offer peace to others while wrestling with your own storm? Those silent sacrifices weren't lost in the noise of this world. They were archived in heaven's ledger. Every seed, every moment, every act of faith sown while bleeding. Galatians 6:9 assures us, let us not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. That proper time is not a myth. It is a marked moment, and you are walking straight into it. Have you felt the tension lately? That quiet sense that something is shifting, even if your circumstances haven't changed yet. That's not confusion, that's confirmation. The soil is trembling. The ground is preparing to push forth fruit, not just for survival, but for supernatural surplus. You didn't give to get, you gave because your spirit understood something deeper. Seeing is never lost in the kingdom, and while the world may have ignored your generosity, heaven kept count. Jesus once stood by the temple watching people put their offerings into the treasury. The wealthy gave large amounts, but a poor widow dropped in 2 small coins. Jesus stopped everything and said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. Luke 21:3. God doesn't measure giving by amount, He measures by sacrifice. How many moments in your life mirror hers? When you gave your last, not knowing if you'd have enough for tomorrow. When you prayed for others while no one was praying for you. When you encouraged someone who never even checked in on you again. Denzel Washington, despite fame and fortune, has repeatedly spoken of giving back. Not just financially, but spiritually. In one of his early testimonies, he mentioned how his mother taught him to give even when they had little. And now his life reflects a spiritual harvest far greater than his net worth. That's what happens when generosity flows from revelation, not reputation. Leona, a single nurse in Detroit who kept buying groceries for patients' families during the pandemic, even while her own rent was overdue. She didn't wait for excess. She acted from compassion. 2 years later, the hospital named a scholarship fund after her, and the mayor awarded her a home. When giving comes from covenant, reward comes from heaven. Job 42:10 declares, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. But restoration didn't come after the loss. It came after he prayed for his friends. Even while wounded, he gave. And that kind of sowing breaks the rules of natural return. Have you begun to feel heaven leaning toward you? Like the sky itself is shifting above your story? That's not your imagination. That's alignment. The same angels who documented your pain are now delivering your reward. You didn't give to build an image. You gave to honor a covenant. And now the covenant is answering back, not with trickles, but with thunder. You are about to witness what divine reciprocity looks like. Malachi 3:10 proclaims, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse and see if I will not throw open the windows of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to..." That's not poetry, that's prophecy. Chosen one, prepare your storage. Your drought is ending. The clouds are gathering, the heavens are parting, not to sprinkle, but to pour, not because you earned it, but because you endured it. You gave through tears. Now you will receive through joy. You sowed in obscurity. Now you will reap in visibility. You endured the drought. Now you will host the downpour, and all of it. Every blessing, every breakthrough, every open door will be proof. Proof that God was watching. Proof that He never overlooks the obedient. Proof that those who give in pain will reap in peace. Chapter 6, God saw you heal without closure. It didn't break loudly, it broke quietly inside you, in rooms where no one heard, in moments where you smiled politely, but were falling apart internally. This wasn't a public crisis. It was a private crucifixion. You grieved in spaces where healing had no ceremony, where closure never came, and yet you still chose wholeness. Have you ever had to release someone who never even asked to be forgiven? That's a kind of surrender the world doesn't teach, but heaven treasures it. You didn't get the apology, the explanation, the closure you deserved. You got silence. And still you walked away with grace, not because it was easy, but because you knew bitterness wasn't worthy of your future. You let go not because they made it right, but because God was making you new. Jesus walked that same path on the cross, bruised and broken by betrayal. He said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. No apology, no admission from those who crucified Him, just silence from the crowd. And still He forgave, not to free them, but to fulfill the kingdom. That's not just divine, it's the model, and you followed it. What kind of strength does it take to heal in the dark while holding your peace in the light? You know, because you did it. Rewriting texts you never sent, holding back words that would have been justified but not fruitful, choosing peace over proving your pain. Every time you whispered, "God, help me, let this go," angels listened. Every time you laid down the desire for revenge, heaven took note. What others called weakness was actually worship. What they called passivity was actually prophetic restraint. Joseph experienced that same mystery, betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, abandoned in a dungeon. He had no closure, no justice system, no final confrontation. But when he saw them again, he wept not with anger, but with compassion. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Genesis 50:20. He didn't wait on their confession, he trusted God's conclusion. Have you noticed how healing came the moment you stopped needing an ending to write a new beginning? You weren't waiting for them anymore. You were waiting on God. And He came in whispers, in strength, in subtle shifts of your heart. Psalm 147:3 says, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their words. That means God didn't need the words to begin your restoration. He saw the moment you unclench your fist and opened your palms, the moment you cried without clarity but chose peace anyway. If you wish to express your support further, you have the option to give super thanks with contributions of up to $120, 0 cents. I pay men to get blessing 100 million.